8 years. 8 long years since Richard Blackwood's world shattered into a million pieces. The night his 12-year-old daughter Grace vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a father's broken heart. Tonight, something compelled Richard to walk through the worst neighborhoods of Chicago. Something he couldn't explain. Then he saw him, a street kid, maybe 15, huddled in the shadows. But it wasn't the boy that made Richard's heart stop. It was the necklace around his neck. A butterfly pendant Richard had given his daughter Grace on her 10th birthday. The butterfly necklace that belonged to his late wife. The necklace Grace was wearing the night she disappeared. Richard's hands trembled as memories flooded back. How was this possible? How did this street kid have his daughter's most precious possession? That horrible night when the police searched everywhere. When they found no trace of Grace. When hope began to fade. Marcus stood up, unaware that he was being watched. Unaware that the necklace around his neck held the key to a father's 8-year nightmare. Richard knew he had to follow. He had to find out how this boy came to possess Grace's necklace, even if it led him into danger. Through narrow alleys and abandoned lots, Richard followed silently, his heart pounding with each step, afraid to lose sight of the only clue he'd found in 8 years. He remembered Grace's last words to him, "Good night, Daddy. I love you to the moon and back." Words that haunted him every single night. But just as Richard thought he was getting closer, Marcus turned a corner and vanished into the maze of Chicago's forgotten streets. Richard stood in the empty alley, breathing heavily. The boy was gone, but for the first time in 8 years, he had hope. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. Detective Rodriguez needed to know about this immediately. That necklace was one of a kind, custom-made. There was no way another existed. This boy knew something about Grace. As Richard walked back to his car, his mind raced with possibilities. Was Grace alive? Had she given the necklace to this boy? Or worse? Richard sat in his car, staring at the dark streets ahead. Tomorrow, he would return. Tomorrow, he would find that boy. 8 years of searching. 8 years of dead ends. 8 years of wondering if he'd ever see his little girl again. But tonight changed everything. Tonight, Richard Blackwood found the first real clue in his daughter's disappearance. And he wasn't giving up now. Before we continue with this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit that like button if this story has already captured your heart. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing tales that will touch your soul. The next morning, Richard couldn't focus on anything else in his corporate world that had once seemed so important. The image of that butterfly necklace haunted him through a completely sleepless night, replaying over and over in his mind like a broken record that refused to stop. He had to return to those dangerous streets, even if it meant risking his own safety, reputation, and everything he had built. Something deep inside his father's heart told him this was his only real chance to find concrete answers about Grace's mysterious disappearance after 8 long, agonizing years of dead ends, false leads, and crushing disappointments that had nearly broken his spirit completely. Detective Rodriguez looked up with surprise as Richard burst through the precinct doors with an urgency and desperation he hadn't seen in years of their professional relationship. They had worked together extensively during the initial investigation 8 years ago, spending countless sleepless nights following every possible lead, interviewing hundreds of people, and exploring every theory imaginable. Rodriguez had never officially closed Grace's case, always keeping the file active on his desk and hoping against hope for the breakthrough that seemed increasingly impossible with each passing year. When Richard described the butterfly necklace in vivid, emotional detail, the seasoned detective's expression changed from skeptical curiosity to intensely focused determination that matched Richard's own desperate energy. Together, they returned to the exact same dangerous neighborhood where Richard had spotted Marcus during his emotional late-night walk just hours before. Rodriguez knew these unforgiving streets intimately from years of police work, countless arrests, and dozens of cases that had brought him into Chicago's darkest corners. He warned Richard seriously about the territorial gangs, the unpredictable drug dealers, and the complex, unspoken rules of survival in this forgotten part of Chicago, where hope seemed as scarce as safety and trust was a luxury few could afford. The stark contrast between Richard's expensive tailored suit and the urban decay surrounding them made him stand out like a beacon, potentially putting both men in significant danger from those who viewed outsiders with suspicion and hostility. As they walked carefully through the deteriorating streets, lined with broken dreams and shattered windows, Richard's mind involuntarily drifted to happier times that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life entirely. He remembered Grace at 8 years old, her infectious laughter filling the air as they built elaborate sandcastles together during their magical summer vacation at Lake Michigan. She had worn that precious butterfly necklace every single day since he gave it to her on her 10th birthday, claiming with childlike certainty that it made her feel eternally connected to her beloved mother, who had lost her brave battle with cancer when Grace was just 5 years old. The delicate necklace had become her most treasured possession, more valuable to her than any toy or gift he could have purchased. They began systematically asking careful questions among the diverse street community that called these forgotten, neglected blocks their permanent home. Most people were understandably wary and suspicious of talking to complete strangers, especially when one clearly looked like an experienced police officer and the other resembled wealthy corporate authority that usually meant trouble for people in their situation. Rodriguez skillfully used his extensive experience and hard-earned street credibility to approach people with genuine respect, infinite patience, and the kind of understanding that only came from years of working these neighborhoods. Slowly but surely, they started gathering precious fragments of information about a teenage boy who wore a distinctive butterfly necklace and reportedly helped protect other vulnerable kids in the area, acting like their guardian angel. Richard showed Grace's treasured photograph to everyone they encountered during their methodical search, his hands trembling slightly each time he revealed the precious image that represented everything he had lost. Several people immediately recognized the distinctive butterfly necklace in the somewhat faded photo, their eyes lighting up with recognition as they confirmed that they had indeed seen a boy wearing something remarkably similar in recent weeks. One elderly homeless woman with kind, weathered eyes and a gentle manner mentioned seeing the boy near an abandoned warehouse district, always surrounded by younger children who seemed to look up to him like an older brother or protector in this harsh urban environment where adults often failed to provide the care these kids desperately needed. Following the woman's detailed directions and warnings about dangerous areas to avoid, they made their way through the complex maze-like abandoned warehouse district on the neglected outskirts of downtown Chicago. Broken glass and rusted metal crunched ominously under their feet as they navigated carefully through years of accumulated debris, urban decay, and the remnants of Chicago's once thriving industrial past. Rodriguez kept his experienced hand near his service weapon, knowing from years of experience that these isolated areas often served as hideouts for dangerous criminals, drug operations, and people who prefer to remain completely invisible to law enforcement. Richard's heart pounded with each cautious step, torn between desperate hope and the terrifying fear of what they might discover. Another bittersweet memory surfaced unbidden as they continued their increasingly urgent search through the urban wasteland. Grace at 10, just 2 short years before she vanished from his life forever, listening with rapt attention as he read her favorite bedtime story about a brave, magical butterfly who helped lost children find their way safely home to their families. She would always gently touch the necklace during the emotional climax of the story, telling him with absolute conviction that it gave her courage and strength like the heroic butterfly in the tale. The cruel irony of that innocent childhood memory now felt like a knife slowly twisting in Richard's chest as he wondered desperately if his precious little girl had needed that kind of courage in ways he never could have imagined possible. The abandoned warehouse district seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction they looked, creating a concrete jungle of forgotten industrial dreams, abandoned hopes, and economic casualties that stretched beyond the horizon. Each massive building looked virtually identical to the next, creating a disorienting maze that could easily swallow someone without a trace and keep them hidden from the outside world indefinitely. Rodriguez pulled out his police radio to check in with dispatch and report their current location, while Richard scanned every shadow, corner, and potential hiding place with the intensity of a man whose entire future depended on finding answers. He prayed silently for another glimpse of the mysterious boy who held the key to his daughter's disappearance. Just as the sun began to set behind the Chicago skyline, casting long dramatic shadows across the concrete wasteland and painting everything in shades of gold and amber, they made a significant discovery. Hidden strategically between two massive warehouse buildings, they found a carefully constructed makeshift shelter area that showed clear signs of recent human occupation. Cardboard sheets, worn but clean blankets, empty food containers, and personal belongings suggested that multiple people had been living here, possibly including children based on the size of some items. Rodriguez examined the area with his trained detective eye, looking for clues and evidence, while Richard's heart raced with the genuine possibility that they were finally getting closer to finding Marcus, the butterfly necklace, and hopefully the answers about Grace that had eluded him for 8 long years. The next morning arrived with a thick Chicago mist that seemed to mirror Richard's emotional state as he and Detective Rodriguez returned to the warehouse district with renewed determination. They had spent the previous evening strategizing their approach, knowing that finding Marcus in this urban maze would require patience, persistence, and perhaps a little bit of luck. Richard had barely slept again, his mind consumed with questions about how a street kid had come to possess his daughter's most precious belonging. Every shadow in the early morning light seemed to hold the possibility of answers he had been desperately seeking for 8 long years, and today felt different somehow, charged with a sense of destiny he couldn't quite explain. Marcus moved through the familiar maze of alleys and abandoned buildings with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned to survive on Chicago's unforgiving streets for years. The butterfly necklace caught the morning light as he glanced nervously over his shoulder, sensing that something was different today. He had noticed the well-dressed businessman the night before, and street instincts developed through countless dangerous situations told him that the man would return. Marcus had survived this long by trusting his gut feelings and avoiding anyone who seemed too interested in him or the other kids he protected. Today, those same instincts were screaming at him to stay hidden and keep moving. From his concealed vantage point behind a rusted shipping container, Marcus watched as the same businessman from the previous night returned with what was clearly a police detective. His heart began racing as he realized they were actively searching for him, moving methodically through the warehouse district with the determined persistence of hunters tracking their prey. Marcus had learned through harsh experience that adults who came looking for street kids rarely had good intentions, and the presence of a cop made the situation even more dangerous in his mind. He needed to stay ahead of them, but he also felt a strange curiosity about why this particular man seemed so desperate to find him. Richard and Detective Rodriguez followed a trail of subtle clues through the debris-filled alleys, fresh footprints in the dust, recently disturbed piles of cardboard, and empty food containers that suggested recent occupation by someone trying to stay hidden. Rodriguez used his years of tracking experience to read the signs that most people would miss entirely, while Richard's businessman mind analyzed patterns and probabilities with the same focus he once applied to corporate acquisitions. The trail seemed to lead deeper into the warehouse maze, toward areas that were even more isolated and potentially dangerous. With each step, Richard felt they were getting closer to answers, but Marcus seemed to anticipate their every move. Marcus turned a corner too quickly in his desperation to escape and found himself trapped in a dead-end alley with towering brick walls on 3 sides and nowhere left to run. His chest heaved with exhaustion and fear as he pressed his back against the cold brick wall, feeling like a cornered animal with no options left. The butterfly necklace seemed to catch every ray of light filtering down from above, making it impossible to hide the very thing that had drawn his pursuers to him in the first place. He could hear their footsteps getting closer, their voices carrying through the morning air with an urgency that both terrified and confused him because they didn't sound angry or threatening like he had expected. Richard appeared at the mouth of the alley with his hands clearly visible and raised in a peaceful gesture that he hoped would convince Marcus he meant no harm. Detective Rodriguez hung back deliberately, understanding that his presence as a police officer might escalate the situation and cause the frightened teenager to do something desperate. Richard's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Marcus could hear it, but he forced himself to move slowly and speak in the calmest, most reassuring voice he could manage. This was the moment he had been waiting for, dreaming of, and preparing for during 8 years of searching, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake that would send Marcus running again. Marcus pressed himself harder against the brick wall, his young hands instinctively moving to protect the butterfly necklace that had become his most treasured possession over the years. His bright brown eyes darted frantically between Richard and the alley entrance where the detective waited, calculating odds and possibilities with the desperate intelligence of someone who had learned that survival often depended on reading people correctly within seconds. The necklace had been a gift from someone he cared about deeply, and he would rather fight than let these strangers take it from him. Even though something in the businessman's eyes seemed different from the predatory look he had learned to recognize and fear in adults who meant him harm. With movements so slow and deliberate, they seemed choreographed. Richard carefully reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the precious photograph of Grace that he had carried with him every single day for 8 years. His hands trembled slightly as he held it up so Marcus could see it clearly. The morning light illuminating the image of his beautiful daughter wearing the exact same butterfly necklace that now adorned the frightened teenager's neck. "Please," Richard said softly, his voice breaking with emotion he had held back for years. "Just look at this photo. I think you'll recognize the necklace. I'm not here to hurt you or take anything from you. I just need to understand how you came to have something that belonged to my daughter." Marcus's defensive posture began to shift as his eyes focused on the photograph with growing recognition and disbelief. His mouth fell open slightly as he stared at the image of the young girl wearing the identical butterfly necklace, his mind racing to process this impossible connection that seemed to bridge two completely different worlds. The fear in his eyes slowly transformed into confusion and something that looked almost like hope as he began to understand that this man wasn't trying to rob him or arrest him. Instead, this stranger was showing him a piece of a puzzle that Marcus had been carrying around his neck for years without understanding its true significance or the pain it represented for someone else. The resemblance was undeniable and heartbreaking. The same delicate butterfly pendant, the same golden chain, even the same way the necklace caught and reflected light seemed identical between the photograph and the piece of jewelry around Marcus's neck. Richard felt his knees weaken as he saw his daughter's most precious possession being worn by this street kid, who couldn't be much older than Grace would be now if she were still alive. Marcus touched the necklace with newfound reverence, beginning to understand that he was holding something far more significant than he had ever realized. This wasn't just a pretty piece of jewelry. It was a father's last connection to his lost child, and somehow it had found its way to him through circumstances he was only beginning to comprehend. Marcus slowly lowered his defensive stance as the initial shock of recognition began to settle into something resembling cautious trust. The photograph had changed everything. This wasn't some random stranger trying to rob him, but a father desperately searching for answers about his lost daughter. Marcus touched the butterfly necklace with a new sense of reverence, understanding for the first time that he was wearing something far more precious than he had ever imagined. Richard and Detective Rodriguez waited patiently, giving the frightened teenager time to process this overwhelming revelation while the morning sun climbed higher over the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across the urban landscape where hope and despair coexisted in equal measure. For several long minutes, Marcus remained silent as his mind raced through memories and possibilities, trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't even known existed until this moment. The weight of a necklace around his neck suddenly felt different, heavier with meaning and responsibility that he was only beginning to comprehend. His street-hardened instincts told him to be cautious, to reveal as little as possible until he understood the full situation, but something deeper in his heart recognized the genuine pain and desperation in Richard's eyes. This man wasn't his enemy. He was someone who had lost everything and was clinging to the slimmest thread of hope for answers about what had happened to someone he loved more than life itself. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke, his words carrying the weight of memories that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his life on the streets. He told them about Hope, a young woman who had appeared in his life like an angel during his darkest hour when he was just 13 years old, alone, frightened, and struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy him. She had been maybe 18 at the time, with long blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold and blue eyes that held a kindness he had rarely seen in the harsh urban environment where they both tried to make a home among the forgotten and discarded members of society. Richard's heart began racing with an intensity that made him dizzy as Marcus described Hope in detail. The long blonde hair, the blue eyes, the approximate age that would match perfectly with Grace if she had somehow survived and aged during the 8 years since her disappearance. Every detail Marcus shared seemed to align with the daughter he remembered, yet the context was so different from anything he could have imagined that his mind struggled to accept what he was hearing. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward, taking careful notes and asking gentle but probing questions that might help confirm or disprove the connection they were all beginning to suspect existed between Hope and the missing Grace Blackwood. Marcus continued his story with growing emotional intensity, describing how Hope had become like an older sister to him and countless other street kids who had nowhere else to turn for protection and care. She had an almost supernatural ability to sense when younger kids were in danger, appearing out of nowhere to intervene when predators tried to exploit the vulnerable children who lived in the shadows of Chicago's forgotten neighborhoods. Hope shared what little food she could find, offered comfort during the coldest nights, and somehow managed to create a sense of family among people who had been abandoned by everyone else in their lives, including their own biological families who should have protected them. Marcus explained that Hope had given him the butterfly necklace during what turned out to be their final conversation together, just a few weeks before she mysteriously disappeared without any warning or explanation to him or the other kids who depended on her protection and guidance. She had seemed different that night, more serious than usual, almost as if she sensed that danger was approaching or that their time together was coming to an end. She told him that the necklace had special meaning for her, something about courage and finding your way home, and that she wanted him to have it because he reminded her of someone important from her past life before the streets claimed her. Every detail Marcus shared about Hope's personality and behavior patterns sent shockwaves through Richard's consciousness as he recognized traits and characteristics that perfectly matched his memories of Grace's compassionate nature and protective instincts. Even as a young child, Grace had always been drawn to helping others, bringing home stray animals, befriending lonely classmates, and showing an almost intuitive understanding of when someone was hurting and needed comfort. The idea that she might have survived her disappearance and channeled those qualities into protecting vulnerable street children seemed both miraculous and heartbreakingly logical. If such a thing were actually possible after 8 years of believing she was gone forever. Marcus's voice broke with emotion as he described how desperately he had been searching for Hope since her disappearance, checking every abandoned building, questioning every person who might have seen her, and following every rumor or lead that might bring her back to the street family that needed her protection and guidance. He had barely slept or eaten during the weeks since she vanished, driven by the same desperate love and loyalty that now burned in Richard's eyes as he listened to this teenager describe searching for the same person he had been seeking for 8 long years. The parallel between their searches wasn't lost on either of them, creating an unexpected bond of shared purpose and mutual understanding. Richard felt his legs weaken as the implications of Marcus's story began to sink in completely, creating a perfect storm of hope, fear, disbelief, and desperate longing that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained emotional control. Detective Rodriguez placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, recognizing the signs of a man confronting the possibility that everything he thought he knew about his daughter's fate might be completely wrong. If Hope was indeed Grace, if his little girl had somehow survived whatever had happened to her 8 years ago and had been living on the streets all this time, protecting other children while he searched desperately for any trace of her, then they were dealing with both a miracle and a tragedy of proportions he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Marcus made the decision that would change all of their lives forever when he looked directly into Richard's eyes and offered to take them to meet other street kids who had also been helped and protected by Hope. He explained that there were at least a dozen young people scattered throughout the city who owed their lives to Hope's intervention and guidance, and many of them might have additional information about where she had gone or what might have happened to her during those final weeks before her mysterious disappearance. Detective Rodriguez coordinated their movement through the urban landscape, while Richard felt hope blooming in his chest for the first time in years, finally believing that they were getting closer to finding his daughter. Marcus led them to an abandoned lot where several other street kids had gathered around a small fire, sharing whatever food they had managed to find and providing each other with the only family structure any of them had ever known. The children ranged in age from maybe 10 to 17, each bearing the unmistakable marks of lives spent surviving on society's margins. But there was something different about this group, a sense of organization and mutual protection that spoke to Hope's influence on their community. As Marcus approached with Richard and Detective Rodriguez, the other kids looked up with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, clearly recognizing that something significant was happening that might affect all of their lives. When Marcus explained why he had brought these strangers to meet them, mentioning Hope's name and the desperate search to find her, the transformation in the other children's faces was immediate and unmistakable. Eyes lit up with recognition, hope, and deep concern as they realized that someone else was looking for the young woman who had become their protector and surrogate family leader. Each child seemed to have their own stories about how Hope had saved them, protected them, or simply shown them kindness when the rest of the world had turned its back on their existence. Richard listened with growing amazement and heartbreak as he heard story after story that painted a picture of his lost daughter as a guardian angel for Chicago's most vulnerable children. The street children's faces came alive with warmth and genuine affection as they began sharing their most precious memories of Hope, their voices overlapping with excitement and love as they competed to tell the most meaningful stories about the young woman who had changed all of their lives. A 12-year-old girl named Jessie spoke first, describing how Hope had found her hiding under a bridge during a winter storm and had literally saved her from freezing to death by sharing her own coat and finding them both shelter in an abandoned building. Her eyes sparkled with tears of gratitude as she explained how Hope had taught her which dumpsters behind restaurants contained the safest food and which adults could be trusted to help rather than exploit vulnerable children trying to survive on the streets alone. Jessie pulled out a small butterfly charm from her pocket, not as elaborate as the necklace Marcus wore, but clearly part of the same theme that Hope had used to connect with the children she protected. She explained that Hope had given each of them some kind of butterfly symbol, telling them that butterflies represented transformation and the ability to rise above difficult circumstances to become something beautiful and free. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he recognized this as exactly the kind of symbolic thinking Grace had always been drawn to, even as a young child fascinated by the metamorphosis of caterpillars and the miracle of creatures learning to fly despite being born to crawl along the ground. A 14-year-old boy named Carlos jumped up with infectious enthusiasm, eager to share his own transformative encounter with Hope that had literally saved his life when he was at his lowest point. He described how she had appeared like an angel when he was being beaten by older gang members who wanted to force him into selling drugs, stepping between him and his attackers with a courage that seemed impossible for someone her size and age. Hope had somehow convinced the gang members to leave Carlos alone, using a combination of street wisdom and moral authority that none of them could argue with, then had spent hours cleaning his wounds and explaining how he could avoid similar situations in the future while maintaining his dignity and self-respect. Richard found himself wiping tears from his eyes as each story revealed another facet of Hope's personality that perfectly matched his memories of Grace's innate protective instincts and moral compass. Even as a small child, Grace had always been the first to defend classmates who were being bullied, to comfort friends who were crying, and to share her toys with children who had less than she did. The idea that these same qualities had not only survived whatever trauma had separated her from him, but had actually grown stronger and more focused on helping others gave him a complex mixture of pride and heartbreak that he struggled to process. Detective Rodriguez continued taking detailed notes while studying the children's faces for any signs of deception or exaggeration. But everything they shared seemed genuine and consistent with a remarkable young woman who had dedicated her life to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. The children began sharing more specific details about Hope's constant references to butterflies, explaining how she would tell them stories about caterpillars transforming into beautiful winged creatures as a metaphor for their own potential to rise above their current circumstances and become something amazing. She would point out actual butterflies whenever she saw them, claiming they were signs of hope and reminders that even the most difficult situations could lead to beautiful transformations if you had patience and faith in the process. Richard felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he listened to these stories that revealed how Grace had maintained her childhood fascination with butterflies even after losing her memory, using the symbol as a way to inspire hope and courage in the children she protected throughout Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods. As the conversation continued, the children began providing more specific and recent information about Hope's movements and behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Several of them mentioned seeing her near the old abandoned St. Mary's Hospital on the south side of Chicago, a massive structure that had been closed for years and had become a notorious gathering place for the city's homeless population. Marcus confirmed that Hope had mentioned the hospital several times in recent weeks, saying she had been helping some sick children who were staying there because they were too afraid to go to functioning medical facilities where social workers might separate them from their street families or force them into foster care systems that had failed them before. The mention of St. Mary's Hospital sent a chill through both Richard and Detective Rodriguez, as they both knew the building's reputation as one of Chicago's most dangerous locations for vulnerable people. The massive structure had been abandoned for over a decade, but had become an informal shelter for people who had nowhere else to go and couldn't access traditional social services for various reasons. Detective Rodriguez had responded to numerous calls at the hospital over the years, overdoses, assaults, and worse, making it exactly the kind of place where someone trying to help others might encounter serious danger from predators who took advantage of the building's isolation and lack of security or official oversight. As if summoned by their discussion of the abandoned hospital, Mrs. Patterson appeared from the shadows with an urgency in her step that immediately caught everyone's attention. Her weathered face showed a mixture of relief at finding them and deep concern about the information she had overheard regarding Hope's connection to St. Mary's Hospital. She had been searching for Marcus and the other children for hours, carrying news that might explain Hope's disappearance and provide the clues they needed to find her before it was too late. Richard and Detective Rodriguez looked up expectantly as Mrs. Patterson settled herself near the fire, clearly carrying information that could change everything they thought they knew about Hope's current situation and the dangers she might be facing. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the weight of years spent observing and protecting Chicago's most vulnerable residents as she revealed that she had known Hope longer than anyone else in their street community, had actually been present when Hope first appeared 8 years ago as a confused and injured 12-year-old girl with no memory of her previous life. She explained that Hope had been found in an abandoned building with severe head trauma, wearing expensive clothes that suggested she came from a wealthy family, but completely unable to remember her name, address, or anything about how she had ended up alone and hurt. Mrs. Patterson had spent months helping Hope recover physically while watching her develop into the protective leader she had become, always wondering about the mysterious past that Hope's damaged memory had locked away from conscious recall. Richard felt his world shift on its axis as Mrs. Patterson's revelation about Hope's timeline and circumstances perfectly aligned with Grace's disappearance 8 years ago, confirming what his heart had already begun to believe, but his mind had been afraid to accept completely. Detective Rodriguez immediately began coordinating plans to search St. Mary's Hospital, knowing that every hour of delay could mean the difference between finding Hope alive and losing her forever to whatever dangers had already claimed her. The street children volunteered to help guide them through the hospital's maze-like interior, while Mrs. Patterson provided crucial information about the building's most dangerous areas and the types of predators who used its isolation to prey upon vulnerable people who had nowhere else to turn for shelter and protection. Mrs. Patterson's voice trembled with emotion as she began to reveal the most crucial and heartbreaking details about Hope's origins and the 8 years she had spent watching over this remarkable young woman who had no idea of her true identity. She explained that when Hope first appeared on the streets as a broken and confused 12-year-old, she had been wearing expensive designer clothes that were torn and bloodied, suggesting she had escaped from some kind of violent situation that had left her with severe head trauma and complete amnesia about her previous life. Mrs. Patterson had initially tried to convince Hope to go to a hospital or contact authorities, but the terrified child had displayed such intense fear of adults and official institutions that it became clear she was running from something or someone who had already hurt her badly enough to cause permanent memory damage. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears as she described that first night 8 years ago when she had found Hope huddled in an abandoned building on Chicago's South Side, bleeding from head wounds and speaking in fragments about butterflies and someone named Daddy who was looking for her. The child had been delirious with fever and pain, but had clung to Mrs. Patterson with desperate gratitude when she provided basic medical care and comfort during those critical first hours. Hope had repeated the word grace several times during that initial night, but when she recovered enough to communicate more clearly, she insisted that she didn't know what the word meant or why it felt important to her damaged memory, leading Mrs. Patterson to assume it might be a religious reference rather than her forgotten name. Richard felt his legs weaken as Mrs. Patterson's detailed account aligned perfectly with every aspect of Grace's disappearance, creating an undeniable connection that confirmed his deepest hopes and worst fears simultaneously. The timeline, the age, the physical description, the expensive clothing, and even the fragments of memory about Daddy and butterflies created a picture so clear that denial was no longer possible. His daughter had somehow survived whatever terrible event had taken her from him 8 years ago, but had spent all of those years living on Chicago's most dangerous streets with no memory of her true identity or the father who had never stopped searching for her. Detective Rodriguez watched Richard's emotional breakdown with professional compassion while continuing to document every detail that might help them understand not only what had happened to Grace, but also what dangers might currently be threatening her survival as Hope. Mrs. Patterson continued her story by describing how Hope had gradually transformed from a terrified, broken child into the remarkable young woman who had become a beacon of hope and protection for Chicago's most vulnerable street population. Despite never recovering her memories, Hope had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when other children were in danger, as if her own traumatic experience had given her insights into the vulnerabilities and needs of others in similar situations. She had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of street life while maintaining strong moral principles that prevented her from resorting to theft, prostitution, or other survival strategies that destroyed so many young people trying to exist without family support or legal protection in an urban environment designed to consume the weak and defenseless. Over the course of 8 years, Mrs. Patterson had watched Hope evolve into something unprecedented in her decades of street experience. A natural leader who had created an informal network of protection and support that extended throughout Chicago's homeless community. Hope had somehow managed to maintain her humanity and compassion despite experiencing the worst that urban poverty could offer, channeling her own pain into a mission of protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. She had developed sophisticated survival strategies while teaching younger children how to avoid predators, find safe food and shelter, and maintain their dignity in circumstances that stripped most people of hope and self-respect, creating a legacy of transformation that had touched hundreds of lives over the years Mrs. Patterson had known her. Richard found himself overwhelmed by a devastating mixture of emotions as he processed the reality of his daughter's 8-year survival story. Immense pride in her strength and moral character combined with crushing heartbreak over the suffering she had endured while he searched desperately for any trace of her existence. The young woman Mrs. Patterson described was everything he would have wanted Grace to become. Yet the circumstances of her development represented a parent's worst nightmare about what could happen to a beloved child. His daughter had been alive all this time, living in the most dangerous conditions imaginable, protecting other children while believing herself to be completely alone in the world, unaware that someone who loved her more than life itself was searching for her every single day without ever giving up hope of finding her again. The street children surrounding the fire nodded in solemn agreement as Mrs. Patterson described Hope's incredible impact on their community, explaining how she had become like a guardian angel for dozens of vulnerable kids who had nowhere else to turn for protection and guidance. Hope had taught them which buildings to avoid, which seemingly helpful adults had ulterior motives, and which authority figures could be trusted versus those who would exploit rather than protect children in desperate situations. She had created a communication network among the street kids that functioned like an early warning system, with older children looking out for younger ones and everyone sharing information about new threats or safe opportunities for food, shelter, and medical care when traditional social services failed to provide adequate protection or support for the city's most forgotten residents. Mrs. Patterson stood up from the fire with a determination that surprised everyone present, declaring that she had spent enough time talking and it was time for action before they lost hope forever to whatever dangers had already claimed her. She explained that she knew exactly where Hope had last been seen and was prepared to take Richard and Detective Rodriguez there immediately, despite the significant risks involved in visiting one of Chicago's most dangerous locations after dark. Her weathered face showed a mixture of hope and fear as she gathered her belongings, knowing that what they found at Hope's last known location would either reunite a father with his lost daughter or confirm their worst fears about what had happened to the young woman who had become like a granddaughter to her over 8 years of shared survival and mutual protection. Mrs. Patterson led Richard and Detective Rodriguez through Chicago's darkening streets with the confident stride of someone who had navigated these dangerous neighborhoods for decades, heading toward the abandoned St. Mary's Hospital, where Hope had last been seen trying to help sick children who were too afraid to seek medical attention through official channels. The massive, decaying hospital loomed ahead of them like a monument to urban decay and forgotten dreams, its broken windows and graffitied walls serving as a beacon for the city's most desperate residents who had nowhere else to turn for shelter. Detective Rodriguez kept his hand near his weapon while Richard's heart pounded with anticipation and terror, knowing that the next few hours would either bring him the greatest joy of his life or confirm his worst nightmares about his daughter's fate. As they approached the imposing structure of the abandoned hospital, Mrs. Patterson stopped and turned to Richard and Detective Rodriguez with a solemn expression that conveyed both hope and warning about what they might encounter inside the building's maze-like interior. She explained that the hospital's layout was confusing and dangerous, with unstable floors, exposed electrical wiring, and numerous hiding places where predators conducted business that thrived in darkness and isolation. The building had become a haven for the city's most vulnerable people, but also attracted criminals who preyed upon those who had no other options for shelter and protection. Mrs. Patterson took a deep breath and led them toward the main entrance, knowing that somewhere within those darkened corridors, they would either find Hope alive and rescue her for whatever danger had trapped her, or discover evidence that would finally explain what had happened to Grace Blackwood 8 years after her mysterious disappearance from her father's world. The interior of St. Mary's Hospital was even more intimidating than its imposing exterior had suggested, with long corridors stretching into darkness, broken ceiling tiles hanging dangerously overhead, and the constant sound of dripping water echoing through the maze-like structure like a metronome counting down to some unknown disaster. Mrs. Patterson led Richard and Detective Rodriguez through the treacherous terrain with the confidence of someone who had navigated these dangerous passages before, warning them about unstable flooring, exposed electrical wiring, and the numerous hiding places where predators might be watching their progress through the building. The beam of their flashlights revealed graffiti, drug paraphernalia, and makeshift sleeping areas that told the story of countless desperate people who had sought shelter in this decaying monument to Chicago's forgotten healthcare infrastructure. As they moved deeper into the hospital's interior, they discovered a carefully constructed makeshift shelter in what had once been a patient room. complete with clean cardboard flooring, organized blankets, and containers that suggested someone had been providing systematic care for multiple people over an extended period. Mrs. Patterson confirmed that this was exactly the type of setup Hope would create when she found children who needed medical attention but were too afraid to seek help through official channels that might separate them from their street families. The area showed signs of recent occupation, with medicine bottles, first aid supplies, and even children's drawings taped to the walls, creating a stark contrast between the nurturing environment Hope had tried to establish and the dangerous, decaying building that surrounded her efforts to heal and protect the vulnerable. In the corner of the shelter area, they found her. Hope was kneeling beside several makeshift beds where young children lay sleeping, her long blonde hair catching the light from candles she had arranged around the room to create a warm, comforting atmosphere in the midst of the hospital's cold darkness. She looked exhausted and thin, her clothes worn and patched, but her gentle movements as she checked on each child revealed the same caring nature that Richard remembered from Grace's childhood, now focused on protecting and healing others who had no one else to turn to for help. Her blue eyes, so familiar yet changed by years of hardship and responsibility, showed a maturity and wisdom that broke Richard's heart as he realized how much his little girl had endured and accomplished while he searched desperately for any trace of her existence. When Hope looked up and noticed the three adults standing in the doorway of her makeshift medical facility, her expression showed immediate wariness and protective concern for the children in her care, rather than any recognition of the man who had been searching for her for 8 years. Her blue eyes, so much like her mother's, studied Richard's face with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate strangers for potential threats rather than hope for rescue or reunion. The complete absence of recognition in her gaze hit Richard like a physical blow, confirming Mrs. Patterson's explanation about the memory loss that had stolen not only Grace's identity, but also her connection to everyone who had loved her before that terrible night 8 years ago, when she had disappeared from his world and been reborn as Hope in this harsh urban environment. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the surreal experience of finally finding his beloved daughter alive, while simultaneously confronting the reality that she had no idea who he was or why seeing her face again meant everything to him. The young woman before him was recognizably Grace in her physical features and mannerisms, yet she was also completely transformed into someone new, someone who had survived unimaginable hardships and channeled her experiences into a mission of protecting others rather than seeking her own comfort or safety. Detective Rodriguez placed a steadying hand on Richard's shoulder while Mrs. Patterson moved forward slowly, speaking Hope's name in the gentle tone of someone who had earned trust through years of consistent care and protection, hoping to bridge the gap between past and present that memory loss had created. Hope remained in a protective crouch near the sleeping children, her body language making it clear that she would defend them against any perceived threat, regardless of the personal cost to herself. Even Mrs. Patterson's familiar presence wasn't enough to immediately ease Hope's concern about these strangers who had invaded the safe space she had created for vulnerable children who depended on her protection and medical care. Her response demonstrated the same fierce loyalty and protective instincts that had characterized Grace as a child, but now amplified and focused through years of taking responsibility for others' survival in circumstances where a single mistake or misplaced trust could result in tragedy for everyone under her care. Richard forced himself to move slowly and speak in the most gentle, non-threatening voice he could manage, fighting back tears to try to find words that might somehow bridge the impossible gap between the father he had been and the stranger he had become to his own daughter. He spoke about butterflies, hoping that some fragment of memory might respond to the symbol that had been so important to Grace throughout her childhood, watching Hope's face carefully for any sign of recognition or connection to the past she couldn't consciously remember. The irony was heartbreaking. He had found his daughter exactly where her compassionate nature would have led her, caring for children who needed protection, yet she was completely unaware that she herself was the child someone had been desperately trying to protect and bring home for 8 long years. For just a moment, when Richard mentioned butterflies, Hope's expression showed a flicker of confusion and something that might have been recognition buried deep beneath the amnesia that had protected her damaged psyche from memories too painful to process. Her hand moved unconsciously to her neck where the butterfly necklace had once rested before she gave it to Marcus. And her blue eyes seemed to search Richard's face as if looking for something familiar that remained frustratingly out of reach. The moment passed quickly, but it was enough to give Richard hope that somewhere deep inside Hope's mind, Grace still existed and might eventually be able to find her way back to the surface if given time, patience, and the right kind of gentle encouragement that didn't force traumatic memories to return before she was psychologically ready to handle them. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward with the careful professionalism of someone trained to handle delicate situations involving trauma victims, explaining in simple, non-threatening terms that they had been searching for someone who might be connected to Hope's past, someone who had never stopped looking for her, and who wanted nothing more than to help ensure her safety and well-being. He avoided using names or specific details that might be overwhelming, instead focusing on the present moment and the immediate concern for Hope's welfare and that of the children she was protecting. His approach was designed to establish trust and cooperation rather than force confrontation with a past that Hope's damaged memory had buried for reasons that were probably necessary for her psychological survival during the years she had spent alone on Chicago's most dangerous streets. The makeshift medical shelter became a space suspended between past and present, hope and heartbreak. As Richard stood just feet away from the daughter he had searched for desperately, while she remained focused on the children who depended on her care and protection. The sleeping children around them represented both the tragedy of Hope's lost childhood and the miracle of her transformation into someone who had chosen to dedicate her life to preventing others from experiencing the kind of abandonment and vulnerability she had endured. Mrs. Patterson and Detective Rodriguez exchanged meaningful glances, both understanding that they were witnessing a reunion that was simultaneously everything Richard had dreamed of and nothing like what he had imagined, requiring patience, wisdom, and careful handling to avoid destroying the fragile trust that might eventually allow Hope to rediscover her identity as Grace and find her way back to the father who had never stopped loving her. Richard made the most difficult decision of his life in that moment, choosing to set aside his desperate need for recognition and reunion in favor of simply being present for his daughter in the way she needed most. He moved slowly toward the sick children, asking Hope's permission before approaching and showing genuine concern for their welfare rather than trying to force memories or explanations that might frighten her away. His business instincts, honed through decades of complex negotiations, told him that patience and consistent actions would be more effective than emotional appeals in building the trust necessary to eventually help Hope rediscover her true identity. The irony was not lost on him that after 8 years of searching, he would need to earn the right to be part of his own daughter's life by proving himself worthy of her trust through service to the children she had chosen to protect. Hope watched Richard carefully as he knelt beside one of the sick children, his expensive suit getting dirty on the hospital floor as he gently checked the boy's fever with the same tender touch she remembered seeing in dreams she couldn't quite explain. Despite her amnesia, something about this stranger's natural way with children felt familiar and safe in a way that confused her trained wariness about adult motives and intentions. She had learned through harsh experience that most adults who showed interest in street children had ulterior motives involving exploitation or control, but this man's concern seemed genuinely focused on the children's well-being rather than his own agenda. Her defensive posture began to soften slightly as she observed his patient, respectful approach to both herself and the vulnerable children under her protection. Without making a big production of his gesture, Richard quietly excused himself and returned 20 minutes later with arms full of medical supplies, clean blankets, and nutritious food that he had purchased from a nearby 24-hour pharmacy and grocery store. He presented the supplies to Hope with the same respectful deference he might show to any medical professional, acknowledging her authority and expertise in caring for these children rather than trying to take over or impose his own ideas about what they needed. His actions spoke louder than any words could have about his character and intentions, demonstrating the kind of consistent reliability and selfless generosity that Hope had rarely encountered in her years of protecting vulnerable children who had been abandoned by the adults who should have cared for them. Detective Rodriguez stepped into the hospital corridor to make crucial phone calls, contacting medical professionals and forensic experts who might help them understand exactly what had happened to Grace 8 years ago that caused her severe memory loss and transformation into Hope. He pulled up old case files on his phone, reviewing evidence from the original investigation while speaking to specialists about head trauma patterns and amnesia recovery possibilities. The detective's years of experience told him that understanding the specific circumstances of Grace's original injury would be essential for helping her heal psychologically and potentially recover her memories safely, without risking further trauma that might damage her fragile mental state even more severely. As the hours passed, Hope and Richard developed an unconscious rhythm of cooperation that felt natural and comfortable despite her continued lack of recognition about their relationship. They worked side by side to change bandages, administer medicine, and provide comfort to frightened children, with Hope gradually accepting Richard's help and even beginning to rely on his steady presence and gentle competence with the kids. Their teamwork revealed personality traits and communication patterns that had been established during Grace's childhood, now manifesting as professional collaboration between two people who shared an instinctive understanding of how to care for vulnerable children. Richard felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he recognized glimpses of his little girl in Hope's mannerisms and decision-making processes, even though she remained completely unaware of their connection. Detective Rodriguez returned from his phone calls with crucial information about the type of accident that could have caused Grace's specific pattern of memory loss and physical injuries. He quietly explained to Richard that forensic medical experts had identified several possible scenarios: a car accident with head trauma, a fall from a significant height, or potentially an assault that resulted in traumatic brain injury. The detective had also discovered that there had been reports of a hit-and-run accident in the area where Mrs. Patterson found Hope on the same night Grace disappeared 8 years ago, suggesting that Grace might have been the victim of a drunk driver who left her for dead in an abandoned building. This information provided the missing piece of the puzzle about how Grace had transformed into Hope, while also opening new investigative possibilities about finding the person responsible for the original crime. Throughout the long night of caring for the children, Hope found herself feeling inexplicably safe and comfortable with Richard's presence in a way that contradicted all of her carefully developed survival instincts about trusting adults who appeared in her life without warning or obvious motivation. She couldn't explain why this stranger's voice seemed to calm both her and the children, or why his way of handling scared kids felt so familiar and reassuring that she found herself relaxing her usual hypervigilance about potential threats. The feeling confused and slightly alarmed her, since her ability to maintain appropriate suspicion about adult motives had been crucial to her survival and the protection of her street family. Yet something deep in her unconscious mind seemed to recognize Richard as someone who represented safety rather than danger. Richard began sharing carefully chosen stories and observations about the children they were helping, speaking to Hope as a respected colleague and fellow caregiver rather than trying to trigger memories or force recognition of their relationship. His approach was designed to build connection through their shared present experience, rather than attempting to access a past that her damaged mind had locked away for protective reasons. He found himself falling into the same conversational patterns he had used with Grace as she grew older, treating Hope with the respect and admiration she had earned through her years of service to Chicago's most vulnerable children, while allowing their natural father-daughter dynamic to emerge organically rather than trying to impose it through revelation or explanation. As the night progressed, and the children settled into peaceful sleep thanks to proper medical care and the comfort of having multiple caring adults watching over them, Richard and Hope found themselves talking quietly about their shared hopes for the kids' futures and their mutual commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The conversation revealed their similar values and perspectives about the importance of dignity, kindness, and second chances for people whom society had written off as disposable or unworthy of care and protection. Hope began to share some of her philosophy about helping others and her belief in the transformative power of love and consistency, unknowingly echoing values and principles that Richard had tried to instill in Grace throughout her childhood, creating a connection that transcended memory loss and recognized the continuity of character that trauma couldn't destroy. By dawn, Hope found herself looking at Richard with a mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and something deeper that she couldn't quite identify or explain, a sense that this stranger who had appeared in her life represented something important and potentially transformative, not just for the children they had helped together, but for her own future as well. She didn't understand why his presence felt like coming home to something she had never known she was missing, or why his patient kindness reminded her of dreams about safety and unconditional love that seemed too good to be true based on her experiences with the adult world. The growing connection between them felt both natural and mysterious, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than forced explanations or emotional manipulation, creating the foundation for whatever relationship might develop as they continued to work together toward the common goal of protecting and healing Chicago's most forgotten children. The storm that had been threatening Chicago all evening finally broke with devastating force, just as Richard, Hope, and the children settled in for what they hoped would be a peaceful night of recovery and healing. Lightning illuminated the broken windows of the abandoned hospital, while thunder shook the unstable structure, causing debris to fall from damaged ceilings and creating an atmosphere of immediate physical danger that required quick thinking and protective action. The children huddled together in fear as the building groaned under the assault of wind and rain, their recently improved medical conditions suddenly seeming less important than the basic survival challenge of staying safe in a structure that might not withstand the storm's intensity. Hope immediately went into protective mode, gathering the youngest children close to her while scanning the room for the safest areas where they could ride out the weather emergency. The children who had been sleeping peacefully just moments before were now crying and clinging to Hope as the storm raged around their fragile shelter, their fear heightened by the uncertainty of being in an unstable building during what appeared to be one of Chicago's most violent thunderstorms in recent memory. Hope moved from child to child with practiced efficiency, offering comfort and reassurance while her own anxiety about their safety remained carefully hidden beneath her calm exterior demeanor. Richard found himself automatically taking charge of the practical safety assessment, using his business experience with building construction and emergency protocols to identify potential structural weaknesses and plan evacuation routes if the hospital building became too dangerous to occupy during the storm's peak intensity. As Richard moved to comfort a particularly frightened little girl who was sobbing uncontrollably, memories flooded back of countless nights he had spent soothing Grace's storm-related fears when she was young, using the same gentle voice and protective presence that had always helped her feel safe during Chicago's frequent summer thunderstorms. He remembered how Grace would run to his room during storms, and how he would hold her close while explaining that thunder was just nature's way of cleaning the air, and that lightning was like fireworks in the sky, transforming her fear into wonder and curiosity about the natural world. The parallel between past and present was almost overwhelming. He was using exactly the same parenting skills with these street children that had developed specifically for Grace's benefit, while his own daughter watched without recognizing the man who had learned to be protective and nurturing primarily through his love for her. Hope found herself studying Richard's interactions with the frightened children with growing confusion and recognition that she couldn't quite explain or understand given her amnesia about her own childhood experiences with storms and protection. Something about his voice, his gentle touch, and his instinctive understanding of what scared children needed to feel safe seemed profoundly familiar in a way that bypassed her conscious memory and spoke directly to emotions and neural pathways that had been established long before her traumatic injury. She didn't understand why watching him comfort these kids made her feel simultaneously safe and homesick for something she couldn't remember, or why his protective presence reminded her of dreams about unconditional love and absolute security that seemed too perfect to have been real experiences from her forgotten past. Without conscious planning, Richard began singing a soft lullaby that had been Grace's favorite when she was small, the melody emerging naturally from his paternal instincts as he tried to calm the children's storm-related fears with the same techniques that had worked so effectively with his own daughter years before. The song was an old Irish melody that his mother had sung to him as a child, and that he had later adapted with Grace's help to include words about butterflies finding their way home safely through any storm or darkness. His voice was rusty from years of not singing, but the familiar words and melody seemed to have an almost magical effect on the frightened children, who gradually stopped crying and began to relax as the comforting sound filled their makeshift shelter with warmth and love that transcended their immediate fears about the storm. As Richard's lullaby filled the shelter, Hope felt tears streaming down her face without any conscious understanding of why this particular song was affecting her so profoundly, creating an emotional response that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than her surface memories could access or explain. The melody seemed to unlock something in her damaged psyche, creating flashes of feelings and sensations that felt like half-remembered dreams about safety, love, and being protected by someone who would never let harm come to her no matter what dangers threatened. She didn't understand why the song made her feel like she was coming home to something she had lost long ago, or why Richard's voice singing those particular words seemed to heal something broken inside her heart that she hadn't even realized was wounded and waiting for exactly this kind of healing touch. Richard noticed Hope's tears and emotional response to the lullaby with a mixture of hope and careful restraint, recognizing that some part of Grace's consciousness was responding to the song that had been so central to their bedtime ritual throughout her childhood, even though her conscious mind couldn't access those precious memories directly. He continued, singing softly while watching her face carefully, seeing glimpses of the little girl she had been in her expression of wonder and inexplicable comfort, understanding that this might be the key to eventually helping her rediscover her true identity without forcing traumatic memories to surface before she was psychologically ready to handle them. His heart ached with the possibility that Grace might still exist somewhere inside Hope's damaged memory, waiting for the right combination of love, patience, and familiar triggers to guide her safely back to consciousness of who she had been before that terrible night 8 years ago. As the children gradually fell asleep despite the continuing storm, comforted by Richard's lullaby and the sense of safety created by having multiple caring adults watching over them, Hope and Richard found themselves sitting together in the flickering candlelight, speaking quietly about the inexplicable sense of connection and familiarity that had been growing between them throughout the night. Hope struggled to articulate feelings and sensations that seemed to exist beyond her conscious understanding, describing dreams and half-memories that felt more real than her waking life, while Richard listened with the patient attention of someone who understood far more about her confusion than he could safely reveal. Their conversation created an atmosphere of intimacy and trust that transcended the artificial barriers created by her amnesia, allowing both of them to explore the possibility of a relationship built on present compatibility rather than forced recognition of a past she couldn't remember. During a particularly intense clap of thunder, Hope experienced her first clear flash of recovered memory, a brief but vivid image of being held and comforted during a storm by a loving father figure whose face remained frustratingly unclear, but whose protective presence felt exactly like Richard's current energy and caring attention. The memory fragment lasted only seconds, but it was accompanied by such powerful emotions of safety and unconditional love that she knew it represented something real and important from her forgotten past, rather than wishful thinking or imagination. She looked at Richard with new curiosity and something approaching recognition, not yet understanding the connection, but beginning to sense that their meeting might not be the random coincidence it had initially appeared to be, and that perhaps her dreams about having a loving father who would never stop looking for her might have been memories rather than fantasies after all. As the storm began to subside and the first hints of dawn appeared through the broken hospital windows, Richard and Hope sat together, surrounded by peacefully sleeping children, both of them sensing that something profound and transformative was beginning to happen between them that went far beyond coincidental meeting or shared concern for vulnerable kids. Hope's growing trust and inexplicable sense of coming home combined with Richard's careful patience and unconditional love to create the foundation for whatever revelation and reunion might be possible as her damaged memory slowly began to heal in the presence of someone whose love had never wavered despite 8 years of separation and loss. The storm outside had been a catalyst for emotional breakthrough inside, washing away some of the barriers that trauma had created while strengthening the bonds of trust and affection that would be necessary for Hope to eventually rediscover her identity as Grace and find her way back to the father who had never stopped believing that love could conquer any obstacle, including amnesia and the passage of time. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the broken windows of the abandoned hospital, Hope watched Richard tend to a young boy who had injured his arm during the storm, observing the gentle precision and instinctive care that he showed while cleaning and re-bandaging the child's wounds. Something about his movements, his voice, and his natural way of soothing the frightened child triggered a cascade of memories that had been buried for 8 years beneath layers of trauma and protective amnesia. The way he held the boy's hand while explaining each step of the medical care, the patient tone he used to distract from the pain, and even the specific words of comfort he chose seemed to unlock a door in Hope's damaged memory that had been sealed shut since that terrible night when her world had changed forever and Grace had become Hope. Hope felt her entire consciousness shift as suppressed memories began flooding back with stunning clarity and emotional intensity that made her gasp with recognition and overwhelming joy. She remembered being 5 years old with a fever, and this same man, her father, sitting beside her bed all night, reading stories and singing lullabies until she felt better. She remembered birthday parties and bedtime stories, trips to the zoo, and quiet moments of father-daughter connection that had formed the foundation of her sense of safety and love in the world. Most importantly, she remembered the butterfly necklace and what it had meant to both of them, a symbol of transformation and the enduring love between a father and daughter that could survive any separation or hardship. The memories came in waves, each one more vivid and emotionally powerful than the last, until she could no longer deny or ignore the truth that had been hidden in her damaged psyche for 8 long years. "Daddy," the word escaped from Hope's lips as barely more than a whisper, but it carried 8 years of suppressed love, longing, and recognition that hit Richard like a physical blow to his heart. She said it again, louder this time, with growing certainty and overwhelming emotion as all the pieces of her broken memory clicked into place and she finally understood who she was and who this man had been to her throughout her childhood. Richard turned toward her with an expression of disbelief and desperate hope, afraid to trust what he was hearing after so many years of searching and dreaming of this exact moment. The look of recognition in her eyes, combined with the word he had been longing to hear for 8 years, confirmed that his little girl had finally found her way back to him through the maze of trauma and amnesia that had kept them apart for what felt like a lifetime. Richard and Grace collapsed into each other's arms with the desperate intensity of 2 people who had been drowning separately and had finally found solid ground together. Their reunion representing not just the end of 8 years of searching and survival, but the beginning of healing that would benefit everyone whose lives they had touched. Their embrace was witnessed by Detective Rodriguez, Mrs. Patterson, and the street children who had become Grace's surrogate family, all of them understanding that they were seeing something miraculous and transformative that would change all of their lives for the better. The abandoned hospital that had been a place of danger and desperation was transformed in that moment into a sanctuary where love had conquered amnesia, where persistence had triumphed over hopelessness, and where a family torn apart by tragedy had found its way back together through faith, patience, and the unbreakable bonds that connect parents and children across any distance or obstacle. Through tears of joy and overwhelming emotion, Richard began explaining the 8 years of desperate searching, the countless false leads, the sleepless nights, and the unwavering faith that had sustained him through the darkest moments when everyone else had given up hope of finding her alive. Grace apologized repeatedly through her own tears, feeling guilty about the years of worry and pain she had unknowingly caused. But Richard silenced her apologies with gentle reassurance that none of what had happened was her fault, and that finding her alive and helping others was worth every moment of anguish he had endured. Their conversation was a healing balm for wounds that had festered for 8 years, allowing both of them to process the trauma of separation while celebrating the miracle of reunion and the possibility of building a new relationship based on who they had both become during their years apart. Detective Rodriguez took charge of the practical arrangements that would be necessary to restore Grace's legal identity and ensure she received proper medical evaluation for her recovered memories and any lingering effect from her traumatic brain injury 8 years earlier. His years of experience with complex cases involving missing persons and recovered memory had prepared him to handle the bureaucratic challenges of documenting Grace's survival and facilitating her transition back into her father's legal custody and care. The detective's professionalism and competence provided a steady foundation for the emotional chaos of reunion, ensuring that all the necessary legal and medical steps would be completed properly while protecting Grace's privacy and giving the family time to adjust to their new reality together. The street children who had become Grace's surrogate family during her years, as hope gathered around the reunited father and daughter with expressions of joy and wonder, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary while also feeling concern about what Grace's return to her previous life might mean for their own futures and safety. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with a wisdom and authority that came from years of protecting Chicago's most vulnerable residents, suggesting that Richard might consider extending his commitment to helping street children beyond just his daughter's immediate circle, creating a foundation or organization that could provide systematic support for the community that had kept Grace safe during her years of amnesia. The conversation revealed the possibility of transforming individual tragedy into collective healing, with Grace's experience becoming the catalyst for broader social change that would benefit all of Chicago's forgotten children. Grace made it clear that while she was overjoyed to rediscover her identity and reunion with her father, she had no intention of abandoning the street children who had depended on her protection and care during her years as Hope, and who would continue to need advocates and support regardless of her personal circumstances. Richard immediately understood and supported his daughter's commitment to helping others, recognizing that her compassionate nature and protective instincts were fundamental aspects of who Grace had always been, amplified and focused through her experiences with trauma and survival. Together, they began discussing ways to create a more sustainable and effective system of support for vulnerable children, combining Richard's financial resources and business expertise with Grace's street knowledge and hard-earned understanding of what these kids actually needed to survive and thrive in an urban environment that often failed to protect them. In the weeks and months that followed their reunion, Richard and Grace worked together to establish a foundation dedicated to providing comprehensive support for Chicago's street children, creating safe housing, medical care, educational opportunities, and job training programs that address the root causes of youth homelessness rather than just treating its symptoms. Grace's unique perspective as someone who had survived on the streets while maintaining her humanity and moral compass made her an invaluable advocate and program designer, while Richard's business connections and financial resources provided the foundation with credibility and sustainability that grassroots efforts often lacked. Their collaboration became a model for how personal trauma and loss could be transformed into positive social change, demonstrating that even the most devastating experiences could ultimately serve a greater purpose when channeled through love, determination, and commitment to helping others who face similar challenges. The story concluded with Richard and Grace visiting the memorial garden he had created in her honor during the years he believed she was dead, now transformed from a place of mourning into a celebration of survival, reunion, and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. They were accompanied by Marcus, Mrs. Patterson, and several of the street children who had become part of their extended family. All of them understanding that Grace's story was not just about one father finding his lost daughter, but about the possibility of creating new forms of family and community based on mutual care and protection rather than traditional biological or legal relationships. As they stood together in the garden, surrounded by butterflies that seemed to dance in celebration of new beginnings, Richard and Grace knew that their reunion was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a new chapter in their lives dedicated to ensuring that no child would ever have to survive alone on the streets without knowing that someone, somewhere, was looking for them with the same unwavering love and determination that had brought them back together after 8 years of separation. Please tell us in the comments where you're watching from what you thought of this incredible story of love conquering all obstacles. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing tales that prove miracles do happen when we never give up hope.